My name is Sarai Vega. I'm a student at the University of Houston downtown, and we're going to be reading this book. I chose this book because it's very informative, and it gives us a lot of facts on our first trip to the moon. Hello, everyone. Today we're going to read a book called Space Busters: The Race to the Moon by Philip Wilkinson. Journey to the Moon. 3, 2, 1, blast off! With a great roar, the Apollo 11 rocket lifted off the ground. Flames and smoke poured from its base as it started its dangerous journey to the moon. President Kennedy had promised an American would reach the moon before the end of the 1960s. It was already the summer of 1969. The astronauts could make history. But Commander Neil Armstrong's heart pounded. He and his crew had only a 50-50 chance of returning alive. Takeoff July 16, 1969. That's Neil Armstrong and his team. Armstrong kept an eye on the instrument panel. He watched the lights and dials change as the rocket quickly picked up speed. Soon they were traveling 25,000 miles an hour, 30 times faster than a jet plane. The force pushed the men back into their seats and made it hard to move. The entire spacecraft was taller than a skyscraper. Most of this was a rocket that held fuel. When the fuel was used up, the astronauts released the rocket and continued their journey in a capsule called the Command Module. Armstrong turned to talk to Edwin Aldrin. It would take 3 days to reach the moon, and Armstrong wanted to go over their planned landing. Aldrin had spent years studying space. He looked forward to walking on the moon and doing experiments there. While Armstrong and Aldrin worked, the third astronaut, Michael Collins, got himself something to eat. Since everything in the spacecraft was weightless, ordinary food could float off a plate. Collins had to eat what looked like baby food from a plastic bag. All the food had been dried to store it for the journey, so it had to be mixed with water, but there was plenty of choice, including beef and chicken. It's the space food. As the spacecraft sped toward the moon, the three men rested. They needed to save their energy so they would be wide awake for the dangers of the moon landing ahead. Out in space, the sun's heat is fierce. The capsule turned around and around. This stopped it from getting too hot on one side and burning up. Sometimes, when the men looked out the windows, they could see the Earth. It was shining brightly and looked like a beautiful giant disk in the sky. The astronauts planned to set down on an area of the moon called the Sea of Tranquility. It was not a real sea because there's no water on the moon. From Earth, the Sea of Tranquility looked like a flat plain, a good surface to land on. The spacecraft circled the moon once, sending pictures back to Earth. Then the big moment arrived. It was time for two of the astronauts to try to land. Armstrong and Aldrin prepared to leave the command module and enter the small landing craft that would take them to the moon. They climbed through the aircraft's narrow hatch. The craft was nicknamed Eagle, but it looked more like a giant metal spider. Collins stayed in the command module and pressed a button. Slowly the two crafts separated. Then the Eagle headed for the moon's surface with its passengers on board. As Armstrong and Aldrin drew close, they could see the surface more clearly. The moon did not look flat enough to land on. It was peppered with craters and covered in boulders the size of small cars. They could not see a smooth place to set down. The Eagle came closer and closer to the moon. It was steered by a computer, but this computer couldn't see the dangerous surface ahead. It kept them straight on course. They were going to crash land in a huge crater. Armstrong grabbed the controls and began to fly the landing craft manually. "How's the fuel?" he asked Aldrin. 8%, Aldrin replied. This meant there was very little fuel left. They had only seconds to land. Armstrong spotted a smooth place. Quickly he began to bring the craft straight down. Moon dust flew everywhere, and Armstrong could not see where they were going. Then he heard Aldrin say, "Contact light." They were down. Armstrong hit the button marked "Engine stop." Then he radioed mission control on the Earth. "The Eagle has landed," he announced. One giant leap. Neil Armstrong wanted to get out and explore the moon right away, but he knew it was important to check the spacecraft first. He and Aldrin needed to make it ready for takeoff. If they met some unknown danger, they might have to leave the moon in a hurry. When the craft was ready, they helped each other put on their outside clothing. They pulled on overshoes, then they put on helmets with visors to deflect the sun's blinding lights. Each man also wore a huge backpack. It contained an oxygen supply so he could breathe. The packs were heavy, but everything is lighter on the moon because there's less gravity, so the men could carry them with ease. "All set for gloves?" Aldrin asked. Once these were on, the spacesuits were complete. Then each man flicked a switch. Motors in the backpacks began to hum. Aldrin felt a whoosh on his face as oxygen filled his helmet. The men were ready to go outside. Cameras in the landing craft sent pictures back to mission control on Earth. As the scientists watched, Armstrong pushed the hatch open and stepped through the gap. Armstrong climbed carefully down the 9 rungs towards the moon's surface. He could see that the moon was covered in a light dust. "It's almost like powder," he said into his radio to mission control. He hoped his feet would find firm ground. Then he stepped off the last rung. Under the dust, the ground was hard. Armstrong was elated. He was the first human being to stand on the moon. His next words were heard all over the Earth. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Neil Armstrong looked over the bleak and barren landscape. Then he raised his camera and took some photographs. Next, he bent over to collect samples for scientists on Earth. He filled a bag with dust, adding some rocks for good measure. Armstrong was overjoyed. He had collected 1 bag of moon samples. Now it was time for some fun. He threw away the handle of the collecting bag. Even with a gentle underarm throw, the handle traveled a long way. The moon's gravity was too weak to pull it down. Aldrin stayed in the landing craft. He watched his friend playing on the moon's surface. "I didn't know you could throw so far," he joked. Aldrin was itching to join Armstrong. At last it was his turn. Aldrin climbed slowly down the landing craft ladder and stepped onto the moon. He looked down. Wherever he put his boots, he left clear, sharp footprints. Together, Aldrin and Armstrong planted the American flag. It was hard to push the flag into the moon's rough surface, but once it was up, the men stood next to it and felt proud. Then Aldrin decided to try running. He made huge strides and bounded like a kangaroo, but he felt as though he was running in slow motion. The astronauts were having fun when Mission Control came on the radio. The President of the United States would like to say a few words to you. Armstrong and Aldrin pulled up short. They were so busy that they had forgotten people all over the world were watching them on television. President Richard Nixon spoke briefly to the men. All the people on this earth are truly one, he said, one in their pride in what you have done. The astronauts got busy. There was work to be done. First, they set up a machine that was able to detect any movements on the moon's surface. The machine would send this information back to Earth. They also set up an instrument to help scientists measure the distance from the Earth to the moon. The men worked for 2.5 hours, then returned to the Eagle to rest. They had to be alert to take off and dock with the command module, which was orbiting the moon. One mistake and they could drift off into space and be lost forever. Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into the landing craft and closed the hatch. They were covered in moon dust. Some scientists had said the dust would catch fire and oxygen, but the astronauts needed oxygen to breathe. They turned on the air supply and waited. The cabin filled with air, but the dust was safe. It did not ignite. The men tried to rest, but they were too keyed up about liftoff. Collins was circling around the moon. Would they ever see him again? When it was finally time to leave the moon, Aldrin hit the button marked Proceed. The engine fired up. Moon dust and debris sprayed all around them. They were off. Homeward bound. While Armstrong and Aldrin were exploring, Collins circled the moon in the command module. For half of each orbit, he was on the dark side of the moon, the side always turned away from the sun. Everything was silent. No radio signals could reach him. Collins was completely out of contact with the rest of the human race. No one had ever been more alone. Collins was worried that Armstrong and Aldrin would get stuck on the moon, or that they wouldn't be able to dock with the command module. If either happened, he would have to leave his two friends to die in space. At last, through his window, Collins spotted the landing craft coming towards him. He steered the command module carefully so that the two crafts lined up, ready for docking. The spacecrafts were almost touching. One false move, and they could miss each other completely. Seconds seemed like hours. Then a buzzer sounded, and a set of latches closed with a clunk. The landing craft had attached to the command module. Armstrong and Aldrin clambered back into the module. At last, Collins could relax. They could all return to Earth together. It would take 3 days for the astronauts to reach Earth. They caught up on their sleep on the long journey home. At last, they entered the Earth's atmosphere, the layer of air around the planet. Then the outside of the spacecraft began to heat up. It became 25 times hotter than a kitchen oven. The spacecraft was protected by a heat shield. Through the window, the astronauts could see bits of the shield come off and fly past them. They prayed that the shield would hold out. Crack! The astronauts heard the noise of the first small parachutes called drogues opening above them. The drogues set the aircraft on an even keel so that it would fall steadily down to Earth. Whoosh! A small vent opened, bringing air into the cabin. This made the air inside the craft the same as it was on the outside. Then there was another cracking sound. "There go the mains," said Armstrong. He meant the main parachutes. Now they were floating slowly down. Finally, with a loud splash, they landed in the Pacific Ocean. The pickup crew found them, floating there several minutes later. They seemed fine, but what if they had brought back new germs from the moon? Swimmers threw germ-proof rubber suits to the astronauts, and the men put them on. It was best not to take any chances. Back on land, the astronauts had to be kept apart from other people until they had been thoroughly tested. The three men had to spend about 2 weeks locked in a special laboratory. Only their doctors were supposed to go in with them, but some of the scientists had touched the moon rock samples by accident, and they had to stay in the lab too. Then one hot evening, the doctors said the astronauts were all in good health. The men were let out of the small room at last, free to go home to their wives and children. The later years. After Apollo 11, there were 5 more Apollo missions to the moon. Some of the astronauts on these missions explored the moon using small battery-powered car called a lunar rover. In 1981, a new spacecraft blasted off, the Space Shuttle. Unlike the Apollo rockets, the shuttle is reusable. Its huge cargo holds carries scientific equipment into space to do work that would be impossible to do on Earth. The Hubble Space Telescope has been repaired in space by shuttle astronauts. It provides fascinating images of space. Astronauts have now lived in orbiting space stations for months at a time. Satellites from Earth have reached the outer limits of our solar system. The next step. The possibilities are endless. Perhaps astronauts on Mars. The end.